They say memory softens with age, that the sharp edges of words dull into something almost bearable. But I can tell you that isn't true, because even now I can hear it. The sound of my own daughter's voice cutting across the table like a knife through glass. No one cares about your stories, Mom. It was not said gently, not disguised as a joke or passed off with the tired irony she so often uses to cover her cruelty. It was spat, like something foul she needed to expel from her mouth before it poisoned her. Everyone at the table froze for a second. The clink of silverware caught midair. The scrape of a chair stilled. Even the roast chicken, gleaming under the soft light, seemed to recoil from the violence of that sentence. And me. I did not flinch, not outwardly. I simply let my mouth pull into that thin smile I reserve for those moments when I must hide the flames under ice. Funny, I said slowly, letting my words hang heavy over the bowls of potatoes and green beans. Those stories built the roof over your ungrateful head. And then I sipped my water, as if nothing had happened, though inside I felt something shift, something small but irreversible, like the soft crack before a wall caves in. I should tell you who I am, though I would rather you know first what was said, because words can slice deeper than any deed, and betrayal often begins not with action, but with the casual cruelty of a sentence. My name is Margaret. I am 82 years old. I live in what they call the garden cottage, though once upon a time it was my home, my sanctuary, the place I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, the place I cooked suppers that filled bellies and stitched curtains out of leftover fabric to keep the cold from creeping through the windows. Now it is a detached shell at the back of what used to be mine, a neat little annex with a key that fits a door which no longer truly belongs to me. People say it's generous of my daughter to let me stay there, but they don't know the truth, that I was the one who paid for the land. I was the one who signed the first deed with a pen that shook from exhaustion, not age, because I had worked 3 jobs to save for it. I was the one who kept the lights on when my husband died young, when the mortgage company threatened foreclosure, when I sold my wedding jewelry piece by piece just to keep the roof solid above us. This house, this place they now call theirs, is stitched together from my sacrifices, and yet I sit in a cottage out back, as if I were a guest, or worse, an afterthought. I live quietly now, or so they think. My days are measured by the rising and falling of light across the garden, by the way the birds return to the feeders I fill with seeds I buy out of my own meager pension, because no one else cares if they come. I tend the roses that climb along the trellis, though no one notices them anymore. My daughter prefers the sleek sterility of trimmed hedges, shrubs cut into geometric perfection, a lawn treated with chemicals until it shines like plastic. She calls my roses messy, as if something that grows with passion and thorns were an offense to her curated vision of life. I keep my door closed most of the time, though sometimes I hear the laughter drifting from the main house, the clink of glasses, the smell of dinners I am no longer invited to cook, though once every holiday meal was mine to prepare. It is a strange sensation to sit in a house you built and feel like an intruder, to listen to the echoes of voices that carry your blood and realize they speak of you in past tense, like a story they've grown tired of retelling. That evening, the evening of the remark, I had been invited, not out of love, not out of longing for my presence, but out of obligation, because family appearances must be maintained, and what is a family dinner without the old mother to wheel out? Like a relic, I sat at the table in the seat they assigned me, not at the head where once I carved turkeys, not at the center where once my laughter tied the conversations together, but at the far end where the light was dimmer, near the draft of the window, so. My words, if I spoke them, would have to travel the longest distance to reach anyone. They didn't ask me to tell a story. They never do anymore. But sometimes stories slip out of me the way breath does, uninvited but necessary. That night, I mentioned something small, a memory of how my daughter, when she was no more than 6, once stood on a stool in this very kitchen and stirred a bowl of cake batter with a spoon, almost too heavy for her little wrists. I thought it harmless, a sweet reminder of the girl she once was, before the layers of ambition and resentment hardened her into the woman who now hosts dinners with catered desserts and disdains the smell of real food. I did not expect gratitude, but I did not expect the slap of her dismissal either. Her words were not just about me. They were about erasure, about silencing the past that does not suit her present. She wants to forget that once she was small, once she was held, once she relied on me for everything from milk to shelter, to the tuition payments that carried her through university, when she swore she'd repay me, though she never did. She wants to forget that she did not build this life alone, that she stands on the scaffolding of my labor, my compromises, my endless swallowing of pride. And when she said, "No one cares about your stories," she did not just cut me out of the conversation. She cut me out of history itself, tried to exile me from the very narrative of this family. That was why I smiled the way I did, why I spoke with that cold, even voice, because I needed her to remember that every beam in this house, every nail in its bones, every brick that keeps it upright is bound with the glue of my stories, my choices, my sacrifices. Without them, there would be no house, no table, no meal for her to host. Afterward, I excused myself with the dignity of a queen, leaving a banquet she no longer enjoys. I walked back to the cottage through the darkened garden, the cold air biting but strangely refreshing, as if the night itself were reminding me that even outside the warmth of their firelit rooms, there is still oxygen enough for me. I lit my small lamp and sat by the window, looking out at the house, whose windows glowed with the life I once believed was mine. I thought of my husband, long gone, who used to say that a house is nothing but walls unless someone fills it with stories. And I wondered what he would think now, to hear our daughter deny those very stories, to see me relegated to the edges like an unpaid servant, but I did not weep. No, I held on to the chill of my smile, the one I had given her at the table, because in that moment I understood something vital. They may try to silence me, to erase me, to tuck me away in the garden cottage like an old trunk too heavy to throw out, but too inconvenient to display. Yet my stories live in the beams and the plaster, in the very air of this place, and no voice, however cruel, can take that away. So here I am, 82, alone but not broken, dismissed but not erased. I begin with the cruelty because that is the truth of how it feels to be me now, but the rest you will hear as I tell it. How I came to be in this cottage, how the house that was mine became theirs, how a sentence at a family dinner became a crack in the silence I had kept too long. For if my stories are what built this roof, then perhaps it is time to tell them again, not for their ears, but for my own. It would be easy to say that the insult at the dinner table was the true beginning, the moment where the threads that had held us together finally snapped. But that is not the truth, because betrayals rarely arrive with trumpets. They come quietly, disguised as small requests, framed as practicalities, presented as sensible decisions, and they spread through a family like damp through wallpaper, unseen until it buckles and tears. The real beginning was 6 months earlier, in the living room I had once chosen the curtains for, when my daughter sat across from me with a file of papers and a rehearsed smile that did not reach her eyes, saying the words that would unravel everything. "Mom, we should put the house in my name. It will make the taxes simpler, and you'll always have your space here. Nothing will change. It's just paperwork." I remember how calm her voice was, the way she used the language of reason and efficiency, as if my life's work could be reduced to a column in a spreadsheet. She spoke of inheritance laws, of probate courts, of complications that could arise if something happened to me, as though I were already half in the grave, as though the most urgent concern was not my presence, but my inevitable absence. She said it was for my protection, for the good of the family, and she slid the pen across the table with a practiced hand, confident I would sign, because I always had. For a moment I almost did, because a mother's reflex is trust, and I had trusted her since the day she came into this world, purple and howling, wrapped in the fragile promise that she would one day love me as fiercely as I loved her. But something in her eyes that day stopped me. A flicker of calculation, a tiny shadow of triumph before the outcome was certain. And I realized she was not asking but taking. I told her I needed time to think, and she smiled too quickly, too easily, and said, "Of course," but I could see the impatience in the way her foot tapped against the rug, in the way her husband shifted beside her like a man who believes the outcome is already settled. They had planned this, rehearsed it, dressed it up as kindness, when it was nothing but hunger for control. In the days that followed, she pressed again and again, always with the same argument. It was practical, it was sensible, it was for everyone's benefit. She said, "You'll still have your little cottage, Mom. You'll always have a place here. Nothing will change." But every time she said it, I heard the echo of the truth. Everything would change, because ownership is not just paperwork, it is power, and once it was gone from my hands, I would be no more than a tolerated guest in the house I had built. I thought of refusing outright, but refusal is not simple when it comes to children, especially daughters who believe themselves to be cleverer, sharper, more modern. They call it a generation gap, but really it is a gulf carved by years of taking without acknowledgement, by a sense of entitlement that grows unchecked. She believed the house was already hers, because she had lived in it as a child, because she had walked its halls and slept beneath its roof, never pausing to consider who paid for that roof, who sat up nights worrying about bills, who stitched clothes by hand when money was short, who swallowed humiliation from landlords and bankers so she could have a room of her own. She believed occupancy was the same as ownership, that blood was the same as sacrifice. The day I signed, or rather, the day I believed I had signed, was not marked by any ceremony. There was no champagne, no photographs, only a weary scrawl of my name across papers I barely read, because the eyes grow tired and the trust runs deep, and because sometimes it is easier to yield than to fight. She took the folder, thanked me with that same bright smile, and said, "This will make things so much easier." Easier for whom, I wondered, but I did not ask aloud. It was only later, when I was alone in my cottage, that I pulled from my drawer the copy of the deed I had tucked away years ago, a habit of caution I never admitted to anyone. I compared the dates, the signatures, the clauses. Something felt unfinished, something missing, as if the transfer had not yet been fully sealed. And in that absence I felt both a tremor of fear and a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, the house began to shift around me, subtly at first, like furniture moved an inch at a time, so you question your memory before you question your eyes. The locks were changed, though no one said so. I found my key no longer fit the front door. I was expected to use only the side entrance to the garden, as though the front belonged to them now, and my presence there would be an intrusion. My photographs disappeared from the hallway, replaced by abstract prints in metallic frames, cold and impersonal. The kitchen I once ruled became her stage. I was told to rest, to relax, to enjoy my retirement, but really it meant to stay out of the way. The cupboards filled with jars I did not recognize, the pantry with foods I would never eat. My casserole dishes were moved to the attic, my recipe cards boxed away. And then, one afternoon, when I reached for the old tea set my husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, I found it missing from the shelf. My daughter said lightly, almost dismissively, "Oh, I donated that, Mom. It was chipped and old. No one uses porcelain anymore." She said it with such casual certainty, as if she had the right to decide what of mine had value, as if my memories were clutter to be swept away. That was when I knew the papers had not just been signatures, they had been a declaration. I was no longer the mistress of this house. I was a tolerated relic, allowed to stay so long as I did not make demands, so long as I did not remind anyone that once upon a time it was mine. It is a terrible thing to realize that your child has crossed from love into calculation, that the girl you held through fevers and heartbreaks now looks at you and sees not a mother, but an obstacle, not a life to honor, but an asset to manage. That day in the living room, with the papers on the table, was the true catalyst. Not the insult at dinner, not the coldness of her tone, but the quiet theft dressed as practicality, the redefinition of me from owner to occupant, from storyteller to nuisance. Betrayal does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes in the form of a pen sliding across polished wood, in the smile of your daughter assuring you that nothing will change, even as everything already has. What followed after the papers were signed was not an immediate storm, not the sudden collapse of everything familiar, but rather the slow and steady dimming of my place within the walls I had once built, a process so gradual that if you were not paying close attention, you might almost believe nothing was happening at all until one morning you awaken and realize you are not quite where you thought you were, that your chair has been moved to the corner, that your voice has been set at a lower volume, that your presence has been reduced to a shadow in your own home. It began with small gestures, the kind so easy to dismiss, the kind you can explain away if you are determined to preserve peace. They replaced the heavy curtains I had chosen long ago with gauzy white panels that looked delicate but offered no warmth. And when I asked why, my daughter smiled tightly and said the house needed to feel lighter, more open, more contemporary, as though what she truly meant was that it needed to feel less mine. My rug, the one I had saved for years to buy, a Persian pattern with deep reds that reminded me of autumn leaves, was rolled up and sent off to storage without my consent, and in its place they laid a flat gray carpet that looked like concrete and felt like nothing underfoot. And when I protested, they said the old rug was too heavy for the new aesthetic, as though comfort and history were crimes against style. The erasure did not end with objects. It seeped into the routines that had once defined the rhythm of our days. I was no longer asked to cook for Sunday dinners, though for decades it had been my labor, my ritual, the way I showed love by kneading dough before sunrise and basting roasts with a patience that turned them tender. Now the meals were catered, delivered in glossy containers that looked sterile even when full of food, and my daughter announced that it was easier this way, less work for everyone, though I noticed she said it with a kind of satisfaction that suggested it was not just convenience she sought, but control. I offered once to bake a pie, and she laughed lightly, saying no one eats pie anymore, that sugar is poison, that my recipes are outdated, as if nourishment and memory could be dismissed with a single fashionable phrase. The kitchen became foreign territory, filled with machines I did not understand, blenders that roared like engines, sleek coffee makers with touch screens that required passwords. I was invited to watch, but not to touch, as though I might contaminate the space with my old hands, as though the very smell of my cinnamon or garlic would linger too stubbornly for her curated vision of perfection. Even the smallest rituals began to vanish. For years, I had watered the front garden in the evenings, humming quietly as the hose sprayed across the roses, the hydrangeas, the marigolds that welcomed neighbors with color. One evening I found the hose disconnected, coiled in the shed, and the soil dry. When I asked, my daughter said there was no need for roses, that they required too much maintenance, that the landscapers would put in shrubs instead, neat little spheres of greenery that never bloomed, never shed petals, never surprised you. I wanted to argue, to shout that life is not meant to be trimmed into spheres, that beauty is not tidy. But I swallowed the words, because by then I had learned that my protests were cataloged as complaints, that each time I spoke up, I was filed. Deeper into the drawer marked difficult. The grandchildren, too, learned by example how to look past me. When they were little, they used to climb into my lap with sticky fingers and demand stories, tales of their mother's childhood or of the summers we spent by the lake, stories that made their eyes grow wide as they imagined a world where their mother was once as small as they were. But now, as teenagers, they carried their phones like shields, and when I tried to begin a memory, their eyes glazed over, their fingers tapping out silent messages to unseen friends. Once, when I told the story of how their grandfather and I built the swing in the backyard, how he had hammered the frame, and I had sewn the seat from canvas, my daughter interrupted with a laugh, saying, "Mom, no one cares about those old stories anymore." And the children laughed with her, not out of malice, but out of imitation, learning by her example that my voice was background noise, like the hum of an appliance you tune out. It was not the children's betrayal that stung, it was hers, because children echo what they are taught, and she was teaching them to forget me, while I still sat in front of them. I began to notice other small exclusions. The locks on the mail cabinet were changed, and when I asked about my letters, my daughter said there was nothing for me, though once I had received birthday cards from cousins, notes from church friends, catalogs I enjoyed leafing through. I wondered if she intercepted them, or if people had simply stopped writing because they assumed I was fading. I was no longer consulted about decisions regarding the house, though I still paid part of the utility bills from my pension, money she accepted without acknowledgement. When I mentioned that the electricity costs seemed high, her husband smiled in that patient, condescending way and explained as though to a child that I needn't worry about finances anymore, that they had everything under control. Control. That was the word that repeated itself silently in my mind, the real truth of what they had sought all along. Not simplicity, not protection, but dominion. There were days when I doubted myself, when I wondered if perhaps I was being dramatic, if perhaps all of this was just the natural order of time, children growing into authority as parents diminish, the house shifting to reflect the tastes of a younger generation. But then I would find another reminder of my displacement, the sound of laughter drifting from a party I had not been invited to, the discovery that my old bedroom furniture had been sold without my knowledge, the realization that I was now expected to knock before entering the main house as though I were a visitor. Each of these things alone might be explained, excused, forgiven, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore, the pattern of erasure. And yet, through all of this, I remained silent more often than not, swallowing my anger like bitter medicine, because mothers are taught to endure, to choose peace over pride, to remind themselves that love is sometimes hidden under the mess of misunderstanding. But as the weeks stretched into months, I began to feel something I had never felt before, something that startled me, the slow erosion not just of my patience, but of my belonging. I no longer recognized myself in their eyes, no longer saw reflected the woman who had built this life with her own hands. I began to feel as though I were becoming invisible, as though I might one day vanish from their lives altogether, and they would only shrug, adjusting their neat little shrubs in the front yard, saying it was easier this way. The escalation was not loud, not dramatic, not violent. It was quiet, like dust settling on furniture you no longer use. It was the gradual shrinking of my world, the reassignment of my identity from mother to burden, from storyteller to nuisance. That was how it happened, not with a bang, but with a slow suffocation. And in that suffocation, I began to sense, deep in my bones, that something would have to change. The night she dismissed my story at the dinner table and I answered her with that cold smile was the night something shifted inside me. Though the change did not arrive like thunder or lightning, but more like a quiet turning of a key in a lock I had forgotten I carried. For so many months, I had let myself shrink, had allowed my place in this house to narrow to a corner seat and a cottage window, had bitten my tongue each time my possessions were donated or my stories dismissed, because I thought that silence was the only way left to preserve a thread of peace. But when she looked me in the eye and spat that my stories meant nothing, I suddenly saw the shape of my erasure with such clarity that it startled me into a different kind of silence, one no longer rooted in submission but in decision. I excused myself from the table that night, not with shame, but with a kind of cold dignity. And when I closed the door of my little cottage behind me, I felt for the first time in a long while that the air inside was truly mine, and that I could breathe there without permission. I sat for a long time at the small wooden table, the one I had rescued years ago from a thrift shop, the one my husband used to read the newspaper at on quiet mornings. And I opened the drawer where I had kept, tucked between old recipe cards and yellowed photographs, the envelope I had not touched in years. Inside was the copy of the original deed, the one with my name alone written in careful ink, the one I had hidden away, not because I distrusted my family, but because some instinct in me had whispered that one day I might need proof of what was mine. Alongside it was the card of a lawyer I had once spoken to after my husband's passing, a man who had told me in plain terms that ownership is not a matter of sentiment, but of documents, of signatures, of what is filed and what is not. My hands trembled as I held those papers again, not from weakness, but from the weight of possibility. And I realized that while my daughter had taken much, she had not yet taken everything. Something unfinished remained, a thread I could still tug, and though I did not know yet whether I would pull it, just knowing it was there filled me with a strange, fierce calm. That night I did not cry, though in the past I might have. Instead, I boiled water, made myself a cup of strong tea in the chipped mug my granddaughter once painted for me at school, and I sat by the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the house that had been mine, and I thought of the years I had given to it, the endless hours of labor and care, the sacrifices I had made so that my daughter could grow within its walls without ever worrying if the roof would hold. I thought of the nights I sat awake at the kitchen table, counting coins to stretch them far enough for groceries, the mornings I walked to work through snow because the car had broken down and there was no money to fix it, the summers I took no vacations so she could attend camp, the winters I went without new coats so she could have textbooks. These were not stories in the way she mocked them. They were the ledger of my life, the proof of what I had built, the foundation of everything she now took for granted. And as I sat there, I began to understand that to allow her to erase me was to betray myself more deeply than she ever could. The shift was not a sudden plan of revenge or a dramatic vow to take back what was mine. It was quieter than that, almost tender. It was the decision to stop waiting for acknowledgement, to stop hoping for respect that would never come, and to begin instead to act as though my dignity belonged to me and not to her recognition. I placed the deed back into the envelope, slid the lawyer's card beside it, and tucked them into the inside pocket of my coat, not hidden anymore, but carried close, as if to remind myself with every movement that I still had choices, I still had a spine, I still had a claim not only to the house but to my own voice. In the days that followed, something in my demeanor shifted too, though I doubt they noticed at first. I no longer offered stories at the table, no longer sought their approval with my words. I became a listener, but not in the way of a silenced woman, more in the way of a watchful one. I listened to the cracks in their stories, the way my daughter and her husband whispered about refinancing, about loans, about how the house could be leveraged for more, and I tucked those words away like pebbles in my pocket. I watched the grandchildren, so absorbed in their screens, and I began to notice that one of them, my eldest grandson, still sometimes glanced at me with a flicker of guilt when the others laughed at my expense, as though he remembered the afternoons when I had sat with him building model airplanes, telling him how patience is a form of strength. I said nothing to him, not yet, but I stored away the look, because even in a house that tries to erase you, there is always at least one witness who remembers. I began small acts of reclamation, not loud enough to provoke, but steady enough to remind myself that I had not vanished. I retrieved my old recipe box from the attic where it had been shoved and placed it on the shelf in my cottage kitchen, opening it each morning as if to remind myself that my hands still knew the language of flour and butter, of salt and heat, even if no one else cared. I bought myself a new journal with a cover the color of midnight and began to write again. Not grand stories, not letters to anyone, but fragments of memory, the smell of my mother's aprons, the sound of my husband's laughter when he first tried to fix the leaky faucet, the taste of wild berries picked in the woods when I was a girl. These were mine, too small for them to steal, too intimate for them to erase, and in writing them I felt the first stirrings of a freedom I had not known in years. The shift, I realize now, was not about the house at all, though the house was its symbol. It was about turning my gaze inward rather than outward, about ceasing to measure my worth by the reflection in my daughter's eyes and beginning to measure it instead by the steady pulse of my own heart. For so long I had been waiting for gratitude, for apology, for recognition, but waiting is a slow form of dying, and that night I decided, without saying the words aloud, that I would no longer wait. I would choose. Perhaps not all at once, perhaps not in ways they would notice, but I would choose myself again, piece by piece, as surely as I once chose them when they were small and helpless and needed everything from me. And so when I rose the next morning and looked out at the garden, at the roses they had declared unnecessary, at the shrubs they had planted like obedient soldiers, I saw something different than I had before. I saw not the signs of my displacement, but the proof of my endurance. The roses still bloomed despite neglect, stubborn and bright against the ordered monotony of the shrubs. They were messy, yes, and thorny, but they were alive in a way the trimmed bushes would never be. I thought then that perhaps I was like those roses, inconvenient, outdated, requiring more care than some wanted to give, but alive all the same, carrying within me a beauty that could not be trimmed away. And for the first time in many months, I allowed myself to smile, not the cold smile of defense, but a real one, soft and private, because I knew that something had shifted, and once a shift begins, no matter how quietly, the ground will never look the same again. If the smile I gave at that dinner marked the beginning of my private rebellion, then what came afterward was the test of whether that rebellion could survive the pressure of the past returning in heavier and heavier waves, because it is one thing to decide in the solitude of your cottage that you will no longer be silent, and quite another to maintain that decision when the very people who silenced you sharpen their tools and return to remind you of your place. The first sign of the tightening came quietly, in the form of a letter slipped under my cottage door, though I knew at once it had not been written by my daughter or her husband, because the handwriting was too careful, too familiar in its long loops and tilting script. It was my grandson, the eldest, the one who sometimes glanced at me with that flicker of guilt, and the note was short but heavy with longing. "Grandma, are you okay? You don't come around much anymore. I miss you. Please don't disappear." I held that letter in my hands as though it were a fragile relic, because within it was proof that my stories had not been completely erased, that at least one child still remembered who I was, beyond the narrow confines his mother had tried to impose. But along with the warmth it gave me came a stab of fear, because I knew that if he reached out, it meant he had noticed my absence, and if he noticed, then so would the others, and nothing threatens control like the possibility of an ally forming, where silence was expected. Not long after, my daughter herself came knocking, though not alone. She brought her husband with her, his smile as polished as ever, and they sat across from me in my little cottage, as though it were an interrogation chamber rather than a home. She began gently, as if we were still playing the game of kindness, saying she had noticed I seemed distant, that perhaps I was not adjusting well to the new arrangements, that maybe I needed more help. I listened, nodding, until her husband finally revealed the true purpose of their visit. He placed a folder on the table, documents printed neatly inside, and began to speak of clarifying the estate, of ensuring security, of avoiding complications down the line. In other words, they wanted me to sign away whatever scraps of claim I still held, to make legal and final the erasure they had already begun in practice. I did not touch the papers. I did not lift the pen he offered. I only sat back and folded my hands in my lap, saying nothing, until my daughter's mask of gentleness slipped, and she snapped, "Mom, why do you have to make everything so difficult? This is for your benefit too, for my benefit." The words rang in my ears long after they left, long after the sound of the car faded down the drive. I boiled water for tea and stared at the envelope in my coat pocket, the old deed with my name still printed clear, and I felt the heat rising in me, not the heat of panic, but of resolve. They thought me weak, thought me cornered, thought me too old to resist, but they had forgotten that age is not the same as helplessness, and that silence is not the same as agreement. I knew then that I would not sign another paper, not one more line, not even a receipt for groceries if it were handed to me by them. But the pressure did not stop. My daughter tried new tactics, softer ones at first, invitations to family events that sounded less like inclusion and more like surveillance, questions about whether I was feeling confused, subtle hints dropped in front of the grandchildren about how sometimes old people don't know what's best for themselves. And then came the cruelest blow, a visit from a man I had never met before, wearing a suit too formal for our small town, who introduced himself as a lawyer representing my daughter and her husband. He spoke carefully, deliberately, about concerns for my well-being, about ensuring I was living in a safe environment, about guardianship arrangements should the need arise. His voice was polite, his tone professional, but beneath the words I heard the real message. They were preparing to argue that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. It was not enough for them to have the house. They wanted my voice, my agency, my right to say no. I thanked him for his time, listened to every word, and when he finally asked if I had questions, I looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Yes. Will you be telling my daughter that I have already spoken to legal counsel of my own?" His composure flickered just briefly, and he shuffled his papers before standing, mumbling something about follow-ups. I closed the door behind him with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I realized in that moment that I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer merely enduring their pressure. I was resisting it openly. Still, resistance is not without cost. That night, I could not sleep, turning over in my mind the possibility that they might succeed, that they might convince others that I was unstable, that I might one day find myself locked not in a cottage, but in some facility where no one cared about my stories at all. I thought of my grandson's letter and held it close, as though it were an anchor to reality, proof that I was still seen. And then, just as the fear threatened to choke me, the phone rang. It was him, the grandson, his voice shaky but clear. "Grandma, I don't know what's happening, but I want you to know I believe you. Mom and Dad say you're being unreasonable, but I know you're not." I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me, because they were the first honest gift I had been given in years. But the past has a way of tightening its grip just when you begin to loosen yours. A week later, at the small cafe where I sometimes go to escape the silence of the cottage, I looked up from my tea and saw her, my daughter, standing in the doorway, her coat too fine for the weather, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. She did not smile. She crossed the floor and sat across from me without asking, her hands folded neatly, as though she were preparing for another negotiation. She began with the usual excuses. She had not meant to hurt me. She had been under stress. The children were difficult. The bills were high. She said, "You've always told stories, Mom, but sometimes stories get in the way of the present." And then, with a softness that almost fooled me, she leaned closer and whispered, "I don't want your shadow in every room." Those words, quiet as they were, struck harder than the shouted dismissal at the dinner table, because they revealed the truth I had long suspected but never heard. She was not simply trying to manage me. She was trying to erase me, because my very existence reminded her of who she once was, of the roots she wanted to deny. I sat there, watching her, and for the first time I felt not sorrow, but clarity. I realized she would never stop, not until I surrendered everything, and that if I wanted to survive with any dignity, I would have to draw a line she could not cross. The escalation was not only hers, it became mine as well. That night I wrote a letter, not to her, but to myself, a declaration that I would no longer sign, no longer yield, no longer accept the narrative she tried to write for me. I tucked it into the same envelope as the deed, so that whenever I touched one, I would feel the weight of the other. The cottage felt small, the shadows long, but within me something had grown larger than fear, a kind of steel that comes only when you have been pressed against the wall and still find yourself standing. And as the days went on, I began to prepare, not with rage or with noise, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has nothing left to lose except her name, her voice, her story. Theirs was the second escalation, the tightening of pressure, the attempt to silence me completely. Mine would come later, sharp and final. But for now, I sat in the stillness of my small room, the letter from my grandson in one hand, the deed in the other, and I whispered aloud, as though reminding the walls themselves, I am still here. The day finally arrived when thought had to turn into action, when the quiet resolve I had carried like a stone in my pocket became something solid enough to wield. And though I had imagined it many times in sleepless nights, the moment itself unfolded with an almost eerie calm, as if I had been rehearsing for it all my life. My daughter and her husband had once again pressed me into a meeting, this time in the main house, around the table where once I carved roasts and poured soup into bowls, though now it gleamed like a stage set designed to remind me of my diminished role. They had papers again, thicker than before, and they spoke with the practiced cadence of people who believe their version of the truth has already been accepted as law. They told me it was urgent, that time was running out, that delays could put everything at risk, and though they framed their words in concern, every syllable dripped with impatience, with the assumption that I would finally relent. But instead of trembling, I reached into my coat pocket and placed on the table my own envelope, the one that had been waiting all this time, its edges worn from my fingers, but its contents as powerful as ever. When I slid it across the polished wood, their faces shifted in unison, first with confusion, then with a flicker of recognition, and finally with something close to fear. My son-in-law reached for it, but I kept my hand steady on top, holding it in place as I said evenly, "Before you hand me another set of papers, perhaps you should remember the ones I never gave up." My daughter's voice wavered for the first time as she asked what I meant, and I looked at her not with anger, but with the calm certainty of a woman who has endured enough, and I told her that the deed had never been properly transferred, that signatures and filings matter more than intentions, that, for all their efforts to erase me, the law still bore my name. Silence settled over the table like a storm cloud, and for once it was not I who filled it with nervous words, but them, scrambling, stuttering, trying to recover ground they thought they had already claimed. I rose slowly, steady on my feet, and said what I had carried in my chest for months. This house is mine, and until I decide otherwise, you are the ones who live here by my permission, not the other way around. My daughter's face hardened, her mouth tightening into the same line I had seen when she was a child denied a toy. But beneath it, I saw the unmistakable glimmer of panic, because she realized in that moment that I was no longer the pliant mother she could manage, but a woman, reclaiming what she had built. Her husband muttered something about lawyers, about courts, about how this would not stand, but I only gathered my envelope back into my coat, looked them both in the eye, and said, "Try me." Then I walked out, each step heavier with the finality of a door closing, though no door in the house had yet shut. The next morning, I went not to the cottage garden, not to the kitchen with its stainless steel appliances that no longer knew my touch, but to the small office of a lawyer downtown, a man younger than my grandson, but sharp-eyed and brisk, who listened as I explained, who read the papers I laid before him, and who finally looked up with a nod that carried the weight of vindication. He confirmed what I had suspected all along. The transfer had never been completed. The filings had never been finalized. The house remained legally mine. The relief that swept through me was not the giddy joy of victory, but the deep exhale of someone who has carried a weight so long she forgot how to breathe without it. He asked me what I wanted to do, and for a moment I sat quietly, thinking of all the years of sacrifice, of the laughter and the tears held in those walls, of the cruelty that had hollowed them in recent years. And then I told him with a steady voice that I wanted to reclaim it fully, to make the boundaries clear, to ensure that never again would anyone speak to me as though I were a guest in my own home. He drafted the documents, and when I signed them, my hand did not tremble. The act itself was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation in that office, no audience to witness the turning of the tide. But when I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, papers folded neatly in my bag, I felt taller than I had in decades. The house stood waiting at the end of the street, its windows gleaming in the pale light. And for the first time in years, I saw it not as a prison of memories, but as something I had built and could claim again. That evening, I changed the locks, not with my own hands, for my fingers no longer held that kind of strength, but by hiring a locksmith who did not ask questions, who simply nodded when I explained, and who handed me the new keys as though he understood that sometimes survival looks like a set of brass teeth on a ring. When my daughter and her husband returned, there was shock, there was outrage, there were words thrown like stones, but I did not waver. I met them at the door, keys in hand, and told them plainly that they had 30 days to find another place, that I would assist with the first month's rent if they needed, but that the house was mine once more, and that my patience had ended. My daughter shouted that I was cruel, that I was abandoning her, that I was tearing the family apart, and for a moment, the echo of her childhood voice trembled in the air, reminding me of nights I had held her through fevers, mornings I had braided her hair before school, afternoons I had sat by the window waiting for her return. But then I remembered the shadow in her eyes when she said she did not want me in every room, and I knew that what I was abandoning was not her, but the illusion that she still cherished me. The climax of this story was not in the signing of papers or the turning of keys, but in the quiet certainty that followed, the realization that there would be no going back to silence, no more swallowing words until they turned bitter in my chest. I had acted, and the action could not be undone, and whether they hated me or pitied me or called me unreasonable, none of it mattered, because I had reclaimed what was mine. That night, as I sat in the living room with my photographs restored to the mantel, with my old rug once more under my feet, I listened to the silence of the house and realized it was not empty. It was full of my breath, my presence, my stories that still clung to the walls no matter how hard they had tried to scrub them away. And in that fullness, I finally felt what I had been denied for so long. Dignity, undeniable and unshakable, the kind that comes not from being given respect, but from seizing it back with your own hands. Now the house is quiet in a way that does not ache, but soothes. The kind of quiet that comes when a storm has passed, and the air is still heavy with rain, yet cleansed of dust. And I walk through the rooms, not as a guest tiptoeing on someone else's floor, but as a woman returned to her rightful place, each creak of the boards under my feet greeting me like an old friend who has waited patiently. The photographs that had been hidden away are back on the walls, their frames slightly crooked but alive with faces that matter. My husband smiling from one, my daughter as a child in another, the grandchildren as toddlers with frosting on their cheeks in a third. And when I pass them, I do not feel bitterness, but a kind of calm recognition, as if to say that memory is not erased by cruelty, that what I gave cannot be taken back, no matter how they tried. The kitchen smells again of garlic and cinnamon, scents that no designer could ever banish, and I brew my tea in the chipped pot I saved from donation, pouring it into the mug with faded paint that still holds the imprint of small hands. It is not grandeur, not victory in the way others might measure it, but it is peace. And peace, when you have lived through betrayal, feels like the most profound form of triumph. I see less of my daughter now, though I know she lingers in the edges of town, her voice sharp with complaint, telling anyone who listens that I turned against her, that I cast her out of the very house she helped fill with laughter. Perhaps she believes it. Perhaps she has convinced herself, but I do not argue anymore. I do not need to. The house knows the truth. The walls remember who laid the foundation. The pipes remember whose hands scrubbed them clean. The garden remembers who planted roses before anyone thought shrubs were easier. Let her say what she will. I have no desire to spend my remaining days correcting her version of events. I have only the desire to live them fully, to let each sunrise find me standing at the window with my tea, watching the light move across the garden where the roses, stubborn as ever, continue to bloom in their defiant untidiness. Sometimes the grandchildren visit, awkward at first, uncertain of which version of their grandmother they are meant to greet, the diminished one they were taught to ignore, or the woman who now carries herself differently, her back straight, her eyes clear. My eldest grandson lingers longest, helping me with small repairs, asking me questions about the past, in a voice that suggests he has begun to suspect the value of the stories once dismissed. I tell him some, not all, because I have learned that not every memory needs an audience. Some exist simply to nourish the teller. But when he listens closely, I give him the gift of detail, the color of the rug we once had, the sound of his mother's laugh before adulthood hardened it, the taste of berry pies baked on summer afternoons when sugar was not yet poison. He writes some of it down, and though he does not say why, I understand. He is beginning to see that the future requires roots, and roots are made of stories. In the evenings, when the house grows still, I sometimes sit at the small desk in my cottage that I have moved into the main house again, placing it by the window where I can see the garden, and I write. Not for lawyers, not for battles, not for evidence, but for myself. I write fragments, reflections, lists of names, half-remembered dreams, and as the pages fill, I feel the kind of completeness that comes not from being acknowledged by others, but from acknowledging oneself. There was a time when I feared invisibility more than anything, when the thought of being forgotten in the very place I had built made me feel hollow. But now I understand that invisibility is not something others can impose. It is something you either accept or refuse. I have refused it, and in that refusal, I have found visibility again, even if only in my own eyes. If another woman were to hear this story, one who sits quietly at her own family's table, shrinking as voices talk over her, erasing her as though she were already gone, I would tell her this: do not wait for permission to reclaim your place. Do not wait for gratitude that may never come. Do not believe that silence will save you. Stories matter not because others care to hear them, but because they are the bones of your life, and bones do not vanish simply because someone closes their ears. Carry them, protect them, speak them when you can, write them when you must, and know that even if those closest to you mock or dismiss them, they still hold the power to keep you standing. So now, when I sit at my table with the evening sun slanting across the wood, I do not hear her voice in my head, telling me no one cares. Instead, I hear my own, calm and steady, answering back as I did that night. Funny, those stories built the roof over your ungrateful head. And then I sip my tea, I let the silence embrace me, and I know without doubt that I am home.